We talk a lot about having that one great cookbook idea, but what if that idea is best manifest as a series of smaller books? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for readers, writers, and cooks. I'm Molly Stevens, and I am here today with Kate Leahy. Hi, Kate.
Hey, Molly.
Cookbook series. I'm looking at my cookbook library. I'm trying to think. Do we have many that are like actual series, like Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3?
I mean, the Time Life ones are probably the most famous, where it was just each volume was based on a country, if I'm remembering correctly. And then more recent years, there's been, I wouldn't call them series, but say brands like Food 52 or Milk Street will have books that come out under their umbrella. But I don't know if those would count as series or if those are just single subject books.
Right. I'm trying to think, like there's certainly like box sets. You can think about the Modernist Cuisine came out in a box set, but I feel like the whole set came out at once.
Oh, and then Canal House did their series.
Yeah, they did a series. Yeah. So that'd be an example. But certainly those Time Life ones are...
Those are the most legendary.
And not only they did the World of Flavor ones, but then they did like, there was poultry and beef and lamb and single subjects. And then tied, they came out one after another in a sequence. But it's a tricky business to do a serialized cookbook, I would think, especially if you wanted them to come out with any frequency.
Right.
Stringing together a whole bunch of single subject books. They'd have to have a similarity, so they would hang together in a series.
It's complicated. I remember working maybe 10 years ago with a chef, and we were working on a book, and we had a great team, and we liked working together. They wanted to pitch a follow-up to this book, and we went to the publisher, and they said, we don't really do that. Your first book kind of has to knock it out of the park. And then even then, they still might not want to sign for a second book because they still want to support that one book idea. It's like you don't want to not cannibalize your sales for a second book, but that can sometimes happen. You wouldn't want to have two back-to-back books that are too similar that weren't part of a series. I don't know. It gets complicated, I think. Yeah.
It's interesting because I was thinking about it, of course, from the author's perspective. It's like, I've got this idea and I want it to do a serialized, but is a publisher going to want to take that risk? I mean, we do know, and we have talked to a lot of authors who end up getting a 2 or even 3 book deal. But that's different than a serialized book where these books are meant to sort of sit together on the shelf and, build on each other. It's an interesting, and it's sort of, to me, it's a bit of a hybrid to a serialized book. It's like between a journal and a book, because we're used to journals obviously coming out, different editions, quarterly or annual or something. Well, today, our guest is someone who has not only pitched, but has published a new series. The first ones came out last fall. Today's guest is Darra Goldstein, and Darra is a renowned author and food scholar. She's a professor at Williams College in Massachusetts, the founding editor of the journal Gastronomica, which a lot of people might know her from. She's authored and edited more than a dozen books, both cookbooks and historical volumes. But today we're going to talk to Darra about her new book series, the first 2 volumes, which came out in October, called Preserved. And she wrote these along with Courtney Burns and Richard Martin. Well, Darra, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
I'm so happy to be here with you.
We're thrilled to have you here, and just huge congratulations on the first 2 volumes of this Preserved series.
Thank you. It's strange to have 2 books come out at once. That's something totally new for me.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. And we want to talk about that. There's so much we want to talk about. But I think we're going to go to the beginning. And where did the idea for a series of cookbooks on preserves come from?
Not to overuse the metaphor, but it's actually been fermenting for a long time. Do you remember the very short-lived journal Cured that came out in 2016 in a single issue?
Yeah.
It was really gorgeous. And it was The Art of Preserving was the subtitle. And it was produced by 0.0, which was basically a video production company in New York City that did Mind of a Chef and Parts Unknown. They got this idea to do a journal on preserved foods. It was very much ahead of its time. And Richard was the editorial director at ZPZ then. And they brought me in as editor-in-chief of the journal. And it was a really, really exciting project. But I don't think ZPZ understood what print was about because they worked in video. And so they kept referring to the first episode. I'd say, no, it's actually called an issue when it's print. And they never really set up subscriptions, and just logistically, it didn't work out. Mm-hmm. And we had a second issue ready to go, but they killed it. It was very expensive. If you remember, it was on heavy paper and lots of artwork. I mean, it was like an
high
art journal.
production value, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was really gorgeous.
Yeah.
And Richard and I stayed in touch, and probably 2 years ago, I can't remember exactly when, we started talking about trying to revive the journal because fermentation was at its peak and there's so many people interested in it. But we wanted to do something equally lovely, but we didn't have the backing of a big corporation, and it would cost a huge amount. So we tried to find funding, which people don't really want to do for a print journal these days. Then we brought in Courtney, and I had met Courtney when she moved from San Francisco to North Adams here in Western Massachusetts to work as this new motel was opening tourists.
Tourists, yes.
Yeah. And for the year she was here, she and I became very close, and we brought her in as the celebrity chef, and we thought maybe that would attract the deep pockets. But that didn't work either. When Jenny Wapner, who is the publisher of Hardy Grant USA. So Hardy Grant is based in Australia with a big presence in the UK, and they just a year ago decided to open an outpost in San Francisco. And Jenny and I had worked on my last 2 cookbooks at 10 speed, and I just adore her. She's an absolutely wonderful editor. We brought the project to her and asked, would Hardy Grant do a journal? And she said, no, we're not really equipped to do that, but why don't you turn it into a series of small books? So it was actually Jenny's idea.
But so your experience, because of course with Gastronomica, and so it was always going to be some sort of a journal publication.
Yes.
Interesting.
That really explains so much, because I was trying to think of like, how did the series originate? Because it's not easy to pitch a series to a publisher. But now thinking of it, you were thinking of the journal side, like a more of a magazine style where you're going to have these quarterly or these editions that come out. It makes a lot of sense why you're releasing a series of books and why you were able to pitch it.
It does make a lot of sense, although I think we didn't realize what it meant to be releasing 2 books at a time and then having the next 2 books, basically the due date for the next 2 books at the same time as the first ones are being released. So it's a rather relentless schedule.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Wow.
So when you switch from journal, which I haven't worked on that many journals where I know, like, I don't know if you sometimes conceive of them as a finite number, but with a book series, you come up with a number 6.
We actually came up with the number 8. And Jenny said, let's make it 6. And right now, so this is condiments, which we really want to start with, and fruit. And then next 2 that will come out next fall will be drinks and vegetables. And then 2 years from now, it will be dairy and grain. And we had an idea for, I think we're going to do cured meats and maybe fish. Or maybe that was 1 volume, and I'm not remembering what the last one might have been, but we also thought that was getting perhaps too esoteric for home cooks, and there's, I think, more anxiety, both on the part of the person offering the recipe and the people making the recipe, to work with things like meat or fish that can go bad more easily.
Yeah, more dangerously, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
How did that come about to decide to release 2 books at the very same time?
Again, that was Jenny. And it wasn't the three of us thinking that might be difficult to do. But we like it because I think that if you have one, it doesn't suggest series. Whereas if you have two, you have the numbers 1 and 2 right on the spine.
Yeah.
And so it already presumes that there will be something more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think it was a really good idea from a marketing standpoint.
That's really true, because that's one of the challenges when somebody, say, would want to pitch a series to a publisher. Usually they would want to see book 1 and see if that's sold before they would say, oh, we have a series potential here. And here you're saying, no, we're starting it with a series. That way you can have that number 1 on the spine and a number 2 on the spine. And when you have them released at the same time, there's that sense of commitment to a series. Whereas if it's just one book, because I've worked with chefs in the past who say, oh, we're doing this book, but I could see a second book in the series. And then you ask the publisher and they're like, that's not usually how we do things. So this is a very smart approach. Tell us about the proposal. Did you have to write a proposal? How did your agent handle the negotiation to make sure they were committed to a series and not saying, okay, if book 1 and 2 don't sell, we're canceling?
I just wanted to add that I think the other reason it was a good idea to have 2 at once is that the subject matters are so narrow. So you have a book on condiments and you don't really have any other category there. So people can't imagine what the next book will be. Like no one, except anyone listening to this podcast, knows that the next one will be drinks and vegetables. So again, this broadens the imagination. So yes, we took it to my agent and the contract was written to include 3 authors and 6 books. I think it was somewhat complicated to write, just because it wasn't working with one person, but she handled it very well.
Yeah. Did you ever think, oh, let's just make one big book on preserving?
You know, we didn't, because we were still thinking in terms of small bites, I guess is what I want to say. Very accessible books. Some of the recipes are really easy. Some are quite complicated, but we wanted people to be able to grasp them in a single sitting instead of a huge tome that is unwieldy and not really user-friendly in the kitchen. So we like the idea of zeroing in on one specific category of ingredients or foods, but then showing different preserving methods within that category.
Yeah, we were talking about this, Kate and I, when we were thinking about these books and the proposal process, and like there really aren't any comp titles for these books. Like in the proposals, we often include other books that might be similar, and I can't really come up with any.
I think what we used for our comp titles were books, whole books on preserving, such as Kirsten Schocke's, her wonderful books on fermentation and other things. But then we use those to show how ours would be different.
Tell us just about starting with condiments, because that's another thing when you're pitching a series, making sure you have that one book to kick it off. What was it about condiments that you thought this is the subject that will introduce this series, will kind of set the stage for it?
Well, the original condiment is salt. And we use salt to season everything. We don't even think of it as a condiment. We think of it as salt or seasoning or something.
I love it in the introduction how you write about how, condiments have had sort of a scandalous past too, with different types of religions or, a government saying, oh, you cannot eat this. This incites too much passion in people. I mean, that right there kind of sets the tone for, just the excitement that condiments can bring to the table, how it can dress up those simple meals that a lot of the world for history would have relied on for sustenance.
Exactly. The Latin root of the word condire means to preserve or to season. And since salt was really the first seasoning, it made sense to start with condiments, I think.
It's the root of it all.
Right.
It is.
Yeah. And then you have that wonderful poem, My Deepest Condiments.
I love that poem. What
Isn't
a treasure.
Amazing. Yeah. it's so wonderful.
It's absolutely a beautiful poem. There's so many things I wanted to get to. The inclusion of the poem and the mustard pots and all this sort of ephemera that's in these books. But you've mentioned the team, and I want to talk a little bit more about how you've mentioned Courtney and Richard, which would be Courtney Burns and Richard Martin. So a chef, a journalist, and a scholar get together.
Walk into a bar.
Walk into a bar.
Right.
So you've got this team, but how do you work as the team is a big question. Like, who does what?
We started working on this during the pandemic. We saw each other during the photo shoot for these 2 books. And that was the first time the 3 of us had been in one place.
Wow.
Yeah, because Richard lives in Brooklyn. Courtney lives on Cape Cod. So we're hours away from each other. We have weekly Zoom meetings. Our experience in the kitchen is very different. Courtney's a professional chef, and she's used to making foods for a gazillion people.
Well, and she's become, I've heard her described as the godmother of fermentation. She's a fermentation expert.
Yes, in a most wonderful way. And I have written before these, I think 6 cookbooks.
Yeah.
So I'm used to writing cookbooks. I'm used to testing things and developing recipes. And I feel comfortable in the kitchen, but not nearly and I love to ferment and to preserve things. I got very interested in that through my work on Russian food, where it's crucial to the culinary culture. But I don't go in as extreme directions as Courtney does. And so for me, that was really exciting to go beyond my comfort level to try certain things that I had never really considered before. Richard loves to cook, but he's not a professional. So it was very useful to have him take recipes that we had worked over, both of us had tested, and then he tried them and he said, this works, or I have trouble with this, or, whatever the issue was. And then we would tweak accordingly.
The recipe question is a really interesting, Darra. Like, you've pulled from every corner of the globe, too, which I think goes back to your initial point of condiments being so universal. And, anywhere there's food, there's going to be some method of preservation involved. And I believe it's 25 recipes per book, and each book is 140 pages, very neat and tidy. But how do you narrow it down to 25 recipes?
It's so hard.
Yeah.
So we tried to, as you say, cover the world. And that was part of the excitement of working on these volumes, especially during the pandemic. Because in a way, we were traveling and just imagining ourselves in other environments. But then if we started feeling as though we had too many Asian recipes, even though Asia is huge, and there's East Asian and South Asian, and there's so many different culinary cultures within Asia, we tried to create somewhat of a balance. We realized in condiments that we didn't have Central and South America represented very well. And I remember the salsa matcha came in more towards the end,
with the
which I'm really
peanuts.
glad. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, I will say, is, I think, what distinguishes that recipe as a Courtney recipe is instead of just adding the peanuts, as you would in a normal salsa matcha, she pickles them first. So what we tried to do is use preserving techniques to differentiate our recipes from other recipes, because you can find recipes for condiments all over the place, but ours sometimes layer on different preserving techniques or add that extra bit of fermentation to really deepen the flavor. I think my favorite example for that is bumper crop ketchup. The tomatoes are fermented, and then there's a tomato paste because we dehydrate them. Then we ferment the paste. We add the spices and let the ketchup sit. And it is the most glorious ketchup this August when tomatoes were ripening in the garden. And my husband's like, we don't really have much ketchup left. And I had to make it again, even though it's a many-day process. It is so worth it.
It's so delicious.
Yeah.
And anyone who grows tomatoes knows there's times where you cannot eat all the tomatoes that you've grown.
Exactly.
So this sounds like a good project.
There's a lime pickle that takes salted lime.
Yes, the lime achar.
Yeah, the lime achar, which looks amazing. And we're talking, Kate and I were talking about the limes and the lemons, and it made me think of when you're trying to organize a cookbook and you have chapters and you have a recipe is it a dessert recipe or is it a, fruit, depending on, and it seems you would have had some of those challenges with these books because the lime pickle is in one of the books and then the preserved lemon is in another. And so figuring out not only what goes in, but where they go.
What's a condiment recipe versus what's a vegetable recipe versus what's a fruit recipe.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're bringing that up because we had the preserved lemons in condiments. Mm-hmm. But then we realized that we wanted to use the preserved lemon paste in the dates. And then we moved it into fruit, where if you compare the two books, condiments really is recipes for condiments. And a couple of the recipes, like the lime achar that you mentioned, have sub-recipes, so you can make the preserved limes, and then you can do whatever you want with them. Mm-hmm. You can turn them into the lime pickle that we give a recipe for, but they're not main dishes or anything. The fruit volume and also vegetables are more recipe-based, I would say, in the sense that we make something that then becomes a salad, or it becomes an entree, or it becomes a dessert. Mm-hmm. Whereas the drinks volume, again, is you make the drinks and you can use the syrup to make a different cocktail or something like that, but you're not really putting the drinks in soup, although you can turn some of the drinks into soup.
I see.
So we did a lot of moving around, and I think one of the things that, like the amazake beverage, when we're working on drinks, we're doing amazake, which is rice-based. And then we thought, well, should that go in grains? So I think that they could fit in multiple categories, but we're trying to think where they might shine best.
Mm-hmm. And that makes sense what you're saying about the preserved lemons being in the fruit volume. Also, if people have a tree of lemons, or out in California, you have a tree of lemons, you're thinking fruit, even if it is going to be a more savory kind of condiment. And then you flip to the date balls with preserved lemon paste, which is a recipe I definitely want to try because it just sounds so great for those of you out there who are looking for like something different for a cookie platter. You take the date paste, you mix it with some spices, you roll it with a little bit of this like preserved lemon paste, which will just, I haven't tried that combination, but I can just imagine in my head, those flavors are going to be great together.
Oh, I'm salivating as you're describing them.
Especially in the middle of the winter.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. I love thinking about this structurally. In either of these volumes, there are a handful of recipes like the apple stack cake or the jammy oat bars where it's a separate recipe calling for one of the preserved recipes. But in general, the recipes stand alone, and then at the end, you have suggested uses. And that balance of figuring out how to, and I want to talk a little bit about how you hope people will use these volumes, but I don't know how you made those decisions, because I think I would have been tempted to give a lot of recipes for using the condiments in other recipes, but then you don't have room for that.
Right. And it loses the essence of the series in a way. It becomes, it becomes a lot longer for one. Yeah. And having two of those books come out in one, I don't think would be as possible. But otherwise,
I wouldn't be here today.
And I'm curious to know, too, just how did you work with Jenny Wapner? Because I know you've worked with her for so many of your projects. So what was that experience like?
Jenny's fabulous. I mean, she's really just a wonderful, wonderful editor. We handed her the manuscript and she basically loved it.
Oh great.
Or the manuscripts, I should put that in the plural.
Yeah.
And she had suggestions. A lot had to do with what we had named things that maybe we called We had too many, fermented this, fermented that in the title. She had good suggestions. She had editorial suggestions. And I think with the very first book, I'm quite sure we ran the table of contents by her. But then in the process of working on the book, the table of contents changed.
Of course.
Right. She trusts you to make the hard decisions before it gets to her desk. So you're turning in a complete, thoughtful manuscript. And I think that's something good for our listeners who have never published a book before to know that an editor-author relationship can vary quite a bit, but the one thing you always want to do as an author is put your best work forward and not turn in something that you think the editor's going, oh, they'll just fix it for us. That's not how it works in book publishing.
No. And I can't do that anyway. It's just not part of my personality.
Right.
Even though sometimes I wish it were. Life would be easier.
You love everything cookbooks, right? And we love making it for you. Here's your chance to help us keep it going. Go to everythingcookbooks.com/support. There you'll find links to all our new great merch, including t-shirts, sweatshirts, even a hat, and our bookstore where we earn commission on every book you buy. You can also leave us a review wherever you listen to the show. Again, that's everythingcookbooks.com/support to find all the ways to show us the love. And thanks for listening.
One of the most delightful things about these little books is how much information you pack into them without feeling dense.
That makes me so happy to hear you say that.
Because they're charming.
Yes.
I mean, they're just, you pick them up and you just wanted everything about them. And we'll talk about this. We are going to talk about the design. We keep saying, but I'm thinking like the head notes in particular, Darra, they just stand out. They're historical, they're cultural, there's technique, there's whimsy in there. And I just think about you and your background, both as a scholar and as a cookbook author, and how you switch between these approaches.
Right.
How do you do it?
I had many years of experience being in academia, but desperately wanting also to be part of the food world that gave me so much pleasure. I remember speaking at an IACP panel once. Someone asked me a question about voice. And I said, we all have a personal voice, but some of us have multiple voices. And you really need to know who your audience is. And if you're pitching for a particular magazine, because back in those days, there were magazines to pitch to, you want to know who the readership is and how you should express yourself. And someone in the audience was just appalled that I, switched back and forth from, one register to another. And I feel as though when I get into food history, which is what I absolutely love, and I could get lost forever in the deep research for finding out where salsa matcha, for instance, originated, then to try to condense that into a headnote that is only, 150 to 200 words. I might have allowed myself a little bit more for some of the others. But you also don't want it to sound stiff. And so I remembered seeing that the wonderful restaurateur and cookbook writer Zarela Martinez had translated salsa matcha as she-man sauce because matcha is the feminine form of macho. And I thought that adding that to the more historical information added that touch of whimsy that makes reading a headnote pleasurable.
And I would say for anybody out there who is trying to up their headnote game, pick up these books to see what Darra makes look so effortless because, like Molly said, you're layering in history, but you're not sounding like it's coming from an academic research journal. It sounds like a personable story, and just how much information you can pack into such a short space is pretty admirable. So anybody looking for how do I get more historic context into my recipes, these are great examples.
Thank you.
You mentioned the far-reaching research and how much you love it. And that's a whole separate conversation because I feel very much the same. But we sometimes get questions from listeners about how to organize research. Did you have any system or any advice? Because it's a lot.
It's a lot. And I think it really depends on personal style and how you absorb information best. I have a huge cookbook library. I live like you, Molly, or even more so in a rural area without access to major research institutions. I mean, Williams has a great library, but it's not focused on cookbooks, even though I try. So I have collected many over the years, and I have a lot of books to turn to. And that's still my go-to rather than going online, because I feel like so much that's online repeats itself and repeats mistakes over and over. And there isn't the kind of vetting that should happen with printed materials, but of course doesn't always there either. But then I do a lot of work on the internet because they're often very obscure things. If I'm working on a headnote that has something in, say, French or Swedish or German or Russian or another language that I can read, then I will try and go to a site in that language so that I can get to the heart of it without having someone's translation of something, or hopefully finding something that has a different way of looking at whatever that food happens to be. But you don't have to necessarily know other languages to do research.
But what I'm hearing is, seek out primary sources as much as you can.
It's crucial.
Yeah.
I mean, you can start with secondary sources, but I did some entries for Wikipedia for when we were working with the British Library to try and get more women on Wikipedia. It's an amazing resource to start with because they have bibliographies, but they won't let you cite primary sources. So, for instance, I did an entry on Phyllis Richmond, who was the restaurant critic at the Washington Post for many years, just an amazing woman. And she told me that when she was in high school, she'd been the editor of her student paper. And I thought that was interesting because already it was the beginning of a later journalistic career. Right. And Wikipedia wouldn't allow that in because I didn't have a secondary source to cite. And I thought, here it is from the so-called horse's mouth.
Right.
And you want to add that kind of personal information. So if you have a good source, or if you know someone who is familiar with whatever you want to write about, absolutely go to that person, because that can add intimacy, that can add another perspective, but don't rely on Wikipedia.
And when you're doing your research, say you find this salsa matcha quote, or you find something that you've translated from Swedish, where do you put your primary source? So when you're looking at the document, or maybe you're going through copy edits and you want to double check a fact, do you have a system where it's easy to pull that information? Because I'm thinking, I know some people might have all these index cards written with little facts, and then where do you store the index cards? You probably have to have your own Dewey Decimal System. What do you teach your students if they're doing primary research?
So my students, I'm sure, take notes on their phone. I'm of an older generation, and that's still not my go-to. So what I do, because I'm working on my desktop computer, I have the recipe for whatever it is, and I say, I just opened to piccalilli, which is this wonderful...
Oh, that's a great story, too, yes.
Yeah, this wonderful piquant yellow condiment, which has a really nice story behind it. But I open a new Word doc and I say piccalilli headnote notes. And then I have a folder on my desktop and I drop all of the individual Word documents into that. So for this book, it has been much more systematic than for my other books, where I feel like a lot of those I wrote out of my head because they were very personal. And these books are not personal to me. I mean, it's very much a collaboration. And so it was more objective, I think, in how the writing was approached. So that's how I organized. And then I can go to that folder and find my notes, and I have the URLs, or I have a note saying this was in such and such's cookbook on page X.
That's terrific. Just knowing the nitty-gritty sometimes can help people just visualize a way to do it themselves. So when they're sitting there, because sometimes you do, we talked to an author and she would say she would write a book, but she just go into a fugue state. Sometimes that's good to get the words down. And then after the fact, maybe make sure you know all those primary sources so that if you are asked by the copy editor, when I was working on a book, it was sort of like I had misspelled a 16th century monk's name. And I looked back and I had my note to where I found it on what page and what book. And sure enough, the copy editor was right. And she saved me on that one.
Oh,
no.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting, Darra, what you're saying too about the two different styles of book writing, like other books where it's more personal and you're reaching back into your own personal recollections and your own deep research that you've been doing. That's a different place to be writing from. But books like these where you're creating a balanced recipe list that you're making sure to represent, different cultures and different areas and different types of fermentation, then you are going and researching the recipes you decide on. So the research is more immediate, not as deeply ingrained, and therefore equally important, but to have the documentation for it is sort of fresher and newer. It's just two different systems.
Yeah, and you just encapsulated it very well.
Yeah, it's just so interesting how books get made.
It really is.
Anyways, let's finally talk about the design, because we've sort of been alluding to it. And single subject books have their own set of challenges. And I think sometimes it's really hard to make them look, captivating and not all the same. And yet you've managed it here.
Well, that's really largely thanks to Francis Baca, who designed them. Francis and I worked together really, really closely for 12 years on Gastronomica. I think it's very important to have a good relationship with your designer and an open relationship, so that if there's disagreement about, a designer has a vision and an author has a vision, and in this case, 3 authors had a vision and the publisher had a vision, there are a lot of pieces to it, a lot of players. So if you have a good working relationship, then the whole thing goes smoothly, because you can talk things out and very openly say why something feels wonderful or why something feels not quite right. And I think that's crucial. So with Francis, it was just very special to reconnect in this kind of, it's an intimate relationship, I would say.
One of the things about doing a book that has a lot of preserved ingredients, from pickles to any kind of preserved fruit or vegetable, you could have a lot of jars, if you weren't careful. And speaking from experience from a book I did about 10 years ago, you can have a lot of jars. But this book, you have a lot of really beautiful, bold images, and there's like a great juxtaposition between I've just turned to page 57 and 6 in the condiments book, and it's black garlic, and there's a jar of black garlic with a spoon that shows that how like charcoal it looks, and then you have the black garlic, the actual cloves on the other page, and it's just such the bold juxtaposition, kind of. It's just really eye-catching. But it also, these are pages that could have been filled with words, that could have been filled with more recipes. You allowed Francis to let the design breathe, I think.
That was hard for me.
I would be hard for me. I believe it.
I have never had a lavishly illustrated cookbook. My last 2 cookbooks with 10 Speed did have gorgeous, gorgeous photographs in them. But a lot of them were of place, to create context. And I think only 25 recipes in both of them out of 100 recipes actually had images. And people complained about that because they like to see how the food looks, whereas I wanted more sense of place. So here, every single recipe is photographed, and some, as you mentioned, multiple times. And David Malash, was a photographer, and Aisha Patel was the prop stylist. And they were both really fabulous to work with. That's also the other big question, like, does your photographer get you? And does the photographer and stylist understand what the book is all about? And we're very lucky, so lucky that we've asked him to continue shooting the next two. So we wanted to give a sense of not too many jars.
Yeah.
It's going to be even harder for drinks, because at least there are a lot more variety in jars for preserving than there are for bottles for drinking. That one's really going to be a challenge. So yeah, a range of ingredients, process, and finished shots. And then there are illustrations as well.
The illustrations, which are just absolutely, I just love the illustrations. And again, they really give the book space. They have, they bring that sort of whimsical element we've been talking about.
It kind of reminds me of what you were saying, that the origin of the series was really going to be a journal. Because now you see like there's a poem, there's the historical sort of artifact side of it, there's the recipes, but there's all these like this beautiful graphic imagery. Is that part of the reason that the books kind of look the way they do, because of that journal background?
Yeah, that was the genesis. I have to say that I wanted a poem in every book. And I found this amazing Mary Oliver poem for fruit. And the publisher nixed it because they said it would have to be translated. And Mary Oliver has a big estate that manages all of her poems. And I said, it doesn't have to be translated. It shouldn't be translated. It should be Mary Oliver in English. If people can't read it, then they can't read it. It wasn't perhaps a very friendly attitude, but I felt like, one of her poems will be a different poem once it's translated. But they didn't want to get into the whole issue of rights. And I pretty much had poems for every single book in mind, but that had to go by the wayside. And the reason we could use Taylor Molly's is that he was very generous, just giving us the poem, and was thrilled to have us use it. And so it didn't become the same kind of issue, which I'm really glad for.
So when you say translated, are these books already going to be translated into other languages?
Well, I mean, they just came out on Tuesday. I don't know that they've sold the rights yet, but we hope so. But the idea is that they could be.
Got it.
And they didn't want any limitation.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Interesting. That's something, you don't really think about that, but yeah.
Can I ask about the covers too? Because covers, we talk a lot about covers on the podcast because that can be a contentious part of the publishing process. What goes on the cover? Does sales and marketing get behind it? But I'm curious to know how it's different maybe with a series than it would be with, say, the standalone books you've done in the past. How did the cover conversation come up with having two books coming out at once? Did it matter as much?
Oh, you guys ask such good questions. You really get to the essence of things. So we obviously wanted a look that could be carried through all 6 books, but that could be differentiated for each volume.
Right.
So that you could pick up a book and you wouldn't necessarily have to buy all 5 other ones. So the way the differentiation comes about is in the band of color. So condiments is this beautiful sage green, and fruit is this beautiful pomegranate red, maybe not quite that deep.
Deep rose, yeah.
Yeah. So we did the photo shoot for both books in a crazily short amount of time. We were very lucky that there was a photograph we felt could be put on the cover. And we were so pressed for time and sort of stressed about the whole shoot that we hadn't really thought through the cover in the beginning. We're thinking about it now for the next round of books. And so this one just happened to feel just right. That's actually Courtney's hand coming in and lifting the top of the jar that has fermented honey in it.
With mustard flowers?
Yes.
And that is the condiments. That's volume 1.
Yes. it just worked really well because it's a vertical format. So then when we got to fruit, which was the same shoot, and again, we hadn't thought that through, we were really lucky that there was another one that had a vertical format that would work well. And we wanted something that contrasted with the band of color. So the backgrounds of the photographs are white, and you have a pop of color that picks up the color band of the title. It's a clean look. It's not busy. There's a lot of open space, which was very much a requirement for the books because they're so small and they're so compact. We didn't want them to feel as though they were, even though they might be dense with content, we didn't want them to feel cramped.
Yeah.
So there are pretty generous margins, and I'm hoping that they convey a sense of openness.
I did wonder about the photo shoot itself. You have all these recipes that require different time commitments. And so how do you get everything ready for a photo shoot?
Well, we brought a lot of the condiments with us because they keep forever.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
true.
part of the purpose of these books is many of them keep for months and months. So we brought them down to New York, and a lot of them were already prepared. Or in the fruit book, the hoshigaki, the dried persimmons were already prepared. The date balls were prepared. Some things we had to do in the kitchen. Somehow we managed to.
And you did them both together.
Yes, we're not doing the next shoot in a single shoot. We're dividing it into two.
So we're sort of wondering where you are with books 3 and 4.
Yeah, we have a photo shoot in another few weeks, and then another photo shoot in January.
Wow.
Oh, we turned one manuscript in already. We turned drinks in, and we'll turn vegetables in next week.
Wow.
Wow.
And no doubt you're
Right.
already
Thinking about 5 and
great.
6.
No, we're going to give ourselves a
okay.
break.
Oh, good. Well, we can't thank you enough for taking time out of your insane schedule.
Right.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to support us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is available wherever you get your audio, and if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It really does help. Any book mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. And thank you, as always, to our editor, Abby Zerkatella. Until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.